See, this is why Peter says, well, as a result of that, here's what it looks like. Once you do this whole indicative, imperative, and you put them together, now, church, oh my goodness, I wish I could preach more. The problem with us is that we have mixed this around. Most people think that as long as you never go away from church and you continue this Christian behavior, you're saved. That's not what the Bible teaches. Can I say that again? I'm going to say that again. See, in spite of your behavior, this is unchangeable. But because this is unchangeable, your behavior must change. Tracking? I'll say that again. In spite of your behavior, your salvation is unchangeable. But because your salvation is unchangeable, your behavior has to change. There's no way around. In other words, the book of Hebrews will say this. If this never changed, it's because there was never salvation. All right. I can preach another sermon right there and there. I'm not going to do that. I got to move forward. And this is what I'm going to say to you. As a result of all this, listen to me. As a result of separating, divorcing, not mixing together the indicative, the historical fact that Jesus died in his body, he suffered in his body, and now you arming yourself, clothing yourself with the same attitude, what happens, here's the result, is that now you, in the context of craziness, brokenness, deception, betrayal, in the concept of whatever you're going through, you are known for your life of service. Now, let me ask you, what's the opposite of service? Serve me? Entitlement? Why me? How come? Who does he think he is? How come she never listens to me? Does that sound familiar? That's exactly your story, my story, isn't it? That's the struggle that we have constantly. What is in for me? I have rights. I'm being violated. See, this is the distinctiveness. In the Old Testament, the doctrine of election or salvation is for service. God choosing Abraham to choose a family, to choose a nation, and to choose the world. So I'm choosing you, Abraham, not because of you, but in spite of, if you're in this place and you're saved, and you have gone through the triple transaction of that tripod, it's exclusively and primarily so you can live a life of service. In the New Testament, the purpose of salvation is to walk in Christ likeness. Now, church, look at me for a second. Listen to me. In moments like this, where our buildings are semi-empty, where we're trying to come back and revamp and rekindle and reconnect with one another, look at me for a second. This is the perfect time for us to remind ourselves that this is the driving force of the Church of Jesus Christ in 2020, in the middle of a pandemic. This is the combination, this is the perfect storm to understand that the salvation of your soul is exclusively for the health of the Church of Jesus Christ. That's what Peter is telling these people 2,000 years ago. And yeah, the church was broken 2,000 years ago. Just wait until we get to chapter 5. In 2 weeks, where we look at the role of the elders and the pastors and all this, why Peter is going to speak to the elders as a fellow elder himself, as the pastors, is because the church was in disarray. It was crazy. In other words, Peter is calling to love, to serve, to walk in Christ-likeness within the real church, not the ideal church. Does that make sense? In the real lifestyle, not in the, one day somehow I will commit, once the church changes, once this. No. Listen, this is the reality that if you're saved, your salvation must be known and expressed through a life of service, Christ-likeness that ultimately is reflected. And by the way, listen to me. Why I'm bringing the health of the church? Oh my goodness. This is why. Because there is no way, biblically speaking, there is no way, it does not exist, it's against the nature of the scriptures, is that you can potentially do this and this on your own. Nobody grows in a life of service, in a life of Christ-likeness on their own. There is no Lone Ranger Christianity. It's an oxymoron, it's a contradiction of terms. When you came out of the water, in water baptism, you did not come just to a new life in Jesus, with Jesus, for Jesus, and then you're going to see Jesus. You came out of the water into a family. And the family is not the ideal, it's the real, just like your family at home. Like my family at home. It's not the ideal, it's just the real family. But in this case, watch this. This is why it becomes non-negotiable, because this is the win. See, in that context, Peter says, the result, who's they? Well, again, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives. The they are those who are not living a life of service and Christ-likeness. Instead, as a Christian, you're entitled, I'm entitled, And then I just need a God that blesses my deal, my agenda, my worldview, my understanding, because, this is who I am. Well, these individuals who are driven by service and Christ likeness, and their driving force is the betterment and the health of the church, are those who do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires. So the implication, watch this please, because I've said this many Sundays now. The implication is that suffering, and I began the whole thing with, the 75th anniversary with COVID-19. Suffering, craziness, brokenness is real. In the Christian community, which we are not immune from suffering, Peter says, not everybody's going to suffer, but every Christian must be ready to suffer. Tracking? I'm going to say it again. In other words, we're not here to suffer. It's not that it's our driving force and we're like looking for suffering. But when he shows up, we have lost the right to ask the question, why me? Now, look at me for a second. Here's the point. What he's trying to remind us is that if or when you suffer, make sure that it's not done, the suffering is not the result of. So let's just have a quick conversation in the last few minutes I have. If you and I can be honest, most of our scars and sufferings in Western civilization, on this side of the world, our suffering is typically because of this. Would you agree with me? In other words, what he's saying is, look at this. See, if suffering is unavoidable, the suffering that God endorses, the suffering that God takes accountability and responsibility, is the suffering that comes to live a life that is according to His will. So Peter is reminding the church that abuse, human trafficking, everything is happening. Peter says, this is what you're responsible for. If you understand that the point of the story is the holiness of God that is reflected on the salvation on a triple legal transaction that reflects into this experience of, once again, service, Christ-likeness for the betterment of the church, all that entails, this is what it means. It means that your life is driven by the will of God in spite of the circumstances. That when, not if, but when suffering shows up, it has to be the result of your zeal and your passion for the gospel of Jesus Christ. That the suffering is not because you have been entitled and you're looking for a church that simply meets your needs and a marriage that actually just endorses your worldview and your understanding. That this is the moment that in the context of brokenness, Christians must be known not for the absence of suffering, but for the suffering that is the result of godliness, holiness, righteousness, that we have the opportunity to reflect this by understanding that our leader, our pastor, our shepherd vocation was Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. Yes, Jesus came to crush the head of the serpent, but prior to the crushing of the head, he was going to be bruised. He was going to be stricken. He was going to be taken. That's Jesus. So if Jesus came to suffer, look at me. That implies that Jesus was not the result of circumstances. Jesus was not the result of fate and luck. And simply, whoever was in charge and the bullying. No, Jesus, every single situation served the purposes of God. Before the creation of the world, the Father had a conversation with the Son. And the Father gave to Jesus those who will be saved. And as Father gave to Jesus those who will be saved, the price to pay was a vocation. Is the understanding that Jesus came as the suffering servant.